our first question for us today is if you could give us an overall assessment of the handling of the European debt crisis so far, and what has been done and what has gone wrong.
Well, I think you can discuss it from the perspective of the glass half full or of the glass half empty. If you have the perspective of the glass half full, you would say, well, it has now been able to stabilize European financial markets, which is a great success. The risk spreads of bonds from problem countries have come down relative to German bonds. We can also see that the recession has come to an end, so most countries have positive growth rates this year. And we can also see that the current accounts that were in deep red some years ago are now in all countries in the positive range. So there are positive things that are there and that one should have in mind. For the case of Greece, I would say also lots of reforms have been enacted, and I think these are very painful reforms, so I think one should also admire this effort that has been made in this country. Reforms concerning the pension scheme, the wage negotiation, minimum wages, the public service. Of course, much more could have been done, but anyhow, a lot has been made. So, from the perspective of the glass half empty, one can say, well, as a legacy of the crisis, we have deep-seated problems, chronic problems, will not go away very soon, and the main problem here is unemployment, which has gone up in the crisis in many countries, and we are, for the euro area as a whole, we are still at levels of unemployment which are more or less record levels, have come down for some tiny tenth of percentage points, but unemployment is very high. And even under positive forecasts for this year, next year, the improvement in unemployment will be relatively limited. And second chronic problem is government debt. We see that also countries have really tried to be strict, have tried to reduce government expenditures, investments, cut wages and everything. We see that it was not possible to stop the increase of the debt to GDP ratios. They are now in all problem countries much higher today than they were in 2010. So if you assume that the whole exercise was about stabilizing, reducing government debt, you can see, well, no improvement at all. Debt levels have increased, and again, according to forecasts, they will increase also next year, even if you have some growth. So this is a second serious problem, and we have a third serious problem, which is the banking system, which is also suffering from the legacy of the crisis. In many countries, banks have non-performing loans, and now banks are afraid of the asset quality review, which has the effect that they have more or less stopped lending in many countries, and so for companies that need funds, it's very difficult to invest.
Professor Bofinger, how would you assess the response of the European Central Bank to the crisis? Would you be in favor of a change in its mandate, which means to include alternative policy targets such as unemployment or growth?
Well, the performance of the ECB during the crisis has improved. At the beginning, the ECB was reacting too late, too little. They even increased lending rates in the middle of the crisis, which was a major mistake. So the response of the ECB could have been bolder and faster. But as far as the last few years, 2 years are concerned, one must say that Mr. Draghi has done a great job. It's really a great success. It's simply by announcing measures without buying any bond from any member state. He has been able to stop the panic in European bond markets, and he has been able to achieve an impressive stabilization of financial markets. Right now, the ECB has now lowered its interest rate again. We have even negative interest rate for the deposit facility. But I think now we have to see that the monetary policy has more or less reached the end of its room for maneuver. We cannot expect much more stimulation from the ECB. So if we see a problem of deflation risk, which is there, we cannot expect the ECB to be the one who reacts. I think now the responsibility is more with fiscal policy.
Professor Bofinger, we would like to invite you, if possible, to concentrate on the proposal of basket Eurobonds. Do you believe that such an idea is politically feasible and a potential solution in the Eurozone crisis?
Well, the idea of the proposal comes from the realization that it's very difficult to have a joint and several liability. So in Germany, and I think also in some other countries, there's no willingness to accept the liability for the bonds of other countries. So I think the prospects for Eurobonds are very low. And so I was thinking, is there an alternative where you develop an instrument which is European, but for which responsibility remains at the national level? And that's why I floated this proposal of this basket Eurobonds, where bonds are issued that are made up of individual, that bonds that are made up as a basket of national bonds, but for which each country is responsible for its own share in the basket. Why is this a good idea? Well, I think one good idea would be that you could develop a very liquid market, which is more liquid than the national bond market, especially of smaller countries. So it would be possible to get lower interest rates. Another advantage could be, but only as a longer-term solution, if most of the government debt is issued in this way, it's no longer possible for financial markets to destabilize the financial system by switching from one bond to another, because they always have to buy the whole thing as a total. And so it's an instrument that could help stabilize financial markets, but of course it's not an instrument that will change the situation in the short term. It's really an instrument for the medium and long term.
Professor Bofinger, could you also introduce to the Greek audience your proposal for the European Recovery Program?
Well, so this is a very recent idea that came from German economics minister, Mr. Gabriel, that one should help European countries to give them the space for more investment. And I've translated this in the idea of a European Recovery Program. The idea is we had rescue programs for the last few years. Now, as the situation has stabilized, so the patient comes out of the hospital, now he needs rehabilitation. So the focus must be now more on how can we increase the growth potential of the countries that have suffered most from the crisis. And my idea is a little bit that such a program should have two pillars. One pillar is more fiscal space for investment, and my idea, I must say we are in a relatively early stage of this whole thing, is that each country develops its own national growth program, identifying priority sectors and identifying the financial needs that are required, and so that political forces in a country formulate this program as precise as possible, and that this, together with this first pillar, there's a second pillar where countries identify the most important structural reforms, let's say for a time frame for the next 4 years. And these two things together, the investment program and the program for structural reforms, go to a European institution, maybe the ECOFIN Council. It has to be authorized by them. So you can just write something down, and there should be the possibility that the European Council says, this is not something that we find reasonable, so you don't get the additional fiscal space.
Professor Bofinger, let us concentrate on a question which dominates the Greek media and public agenda. How do you assess the role of Germany generally in the handling of the European debt crisis?
Well, Germany was confronted out of a sudden with this crisis that erupted in Greece and other European countries, and it was very difficult for Germany to find a solution which was, on the one hand, really helpful for the countries in trouble, but which was, on the other hand, something that was acceptable for the German public. And so I would say the idea was to find compromises how to support countries, and that's what Germany did. First, when the crisis started in Greece, the first response was we do not help them at all. Then it was said, well, yes, we do something for Greece, but only on a temporary basis, the EFSF. But then in the end, Germany was really willing to agree to the ESM, to a permanent rescue mechanism. So I think it was difficult for Germany, and maybe I think that the German authorities could have reacted faster, more proactive. But in the end, one must say that Germany was definitely willing to provide the rescue mechanisms that were required to stabilize the system. One must say, well, the mechanisms that were proposed by Germany would not have been able to stabilize the system. It was the support by Draghi and the ECB was in the end decisive. So I think that the relatively reluctant approach of German politicians to provide support, in the end required that Draghi had to step in and had to say, I will save the thing. But you have to understand the German reaction by taking into account the very skeptical mood of Germans as far as transfers, guarantees for other countries are concerned. So it was a difficult balancing act for our government to go ahead with these rescue mechanisms. And in the end, I would say, as far as mere rescue is concerned, it worked out well. What I would criticize is that in Germany, the approach to consolidation was exaggerated. I think the degree of austerity that was demanded from Germany or from the Troika made things partially worse than better.
Professor Bofinger, let us concentrate now on the Greek crisis itself, and let us ask you at first whether you consider the Greek debt as sustainable, and whether do you believe that a new haircut of the Greek public debt is necessary?
Yes, if you look at the recent report by the IMF on Greece, you see that it's really difficult to achieve the scenario for the debt level that this program envisages, because it assumes on the one hand that it is necessary to increase the primary surplus to 4.5%, which means an additional 2 percentage point consolidation in the next 2 years, which is extremely difficult to achieve and which might also fire back, because it's always a risk if in an economic environment like in Greece, if you consolidate by cutting expenditures or by raising taxes, there's a risk that the multiplier is higher than 1. So in the end, by trying to consolidate, you make the debt problem worse, and you also have a negative impact on growth. So that's one problematic element of this scenario, that it's necessary to increase the primary surplus. And the other critical assumption is that Greece will be able to achieve in the second half of this decade growth rates of almost 5% nominal GDP, which is very ambitious given the situation, which is more or less deflationary, that the recession has not yet fully ended. So this whole scenario is very, very optimistic, and the question that one has to raise is whether it's really a good idea to stick to scenarios which are overly optimistic, which then can really lead to frustration. Because if people really make an effort to reach it, if another painful wage cuts, transfer cuts, social subsidy cuts are taken, in order to achieve the target, but in the end, if you realize the target cannot be achieved, then it's problematic. And so I would say that one needs a discussion whether this is really a realistic scenario. If it comes to the result, it's not a realistic scenario. One has to think of ways of how to reduce the debt burden, either by debt restructuring or by increasing the maturities, by reducing the interest rates to help Greece to deal with this situation.
Professor Bofinger, also would like to know what do you think about the effectiveness of internal devaluation policies applied in countries like Greece?
Well, as long as you are a member of the monetary union, internal devaluation is the only option available. And I think it's impressive how much internal devaluation was possible in Greece. So I think it's only in Ireland that you had such strong cuts in wages as in Greece. So again, one must say there's a strong willingness in this country to do what is necessary to change the situation to the better. So far, the outcome is disappointing, one must say. So also, the wages were cut so much. We don't see a pickup in exports. So exports are very, very weak. So it has. So the lower wages have not translated into more export demand. I think they've also not been translated into more foreign direct investment. So this is a real challenge, I think, also for politicians in Greece, that they create a political environment where it's interesting now for foreign investors. Okay, now wages have come down, and Greece is a good place to produce. It's more competitiveness, but for this you need more political stability. So I think that's maybe one explanation why this internal devaluation, which was quite impressive, has not really showed the fruits that one could have expected.
Apart from Greece, we have also a more general question for you, and this is related to the intense public debate about increasing inequalities. And part of this debate has to do with the social consequences of the austerity policies, while another part of the debate has to do with rising inequalities internationally as the consequence of the operation of the capitalist system more generally. What is your opinion regarding this debate?
Well, I think it's a very important debate. It has been stimulated by Piketty's book. And I think it's a debate that we definitively need, because a lot of dissatisfaction that people have with the euro and with Europe in general is, in my view, related to a growing dissatisfaction of many people with their lives, with their jobs, with their prospects when they retire. So many people feel that the economic situation has not improved in the last years, that their jobs have become more unstable, and when they retire, their pension will not be sufficient. So there is a strong dissatisfaction with many people. And it has to do, in my view, with this growing inequality, with the fact that in the last decades, the share of capital incomes in total income has increased in almost all countries. The share of labor, of course, has decreased, and so we have this dissatisfaction with many people with the economic situation, and this growing inequality has several implications. One is the political implication. If people are frustrated with their lives, they're always eager to find scapegoats, and I think Europe is one of the scapegoats, and it explains why the European elections have led to such positive results for many European Euro-skeptical parties, because Europe is one easy explanation for people who are dissatisfied. Say, well, who is to blame? It is Europe. So growing inequality has negative political implications, but it also has negative economic implications. If more and more of the incomes that are created by the production process go to capital owners instead to the workers, it means that the demand, global demand, declines, because the workers, they spend almost everything they earn, while the capital owners' propensity to spend is much lower, they save much more. And I think that's what we see in several years, that the financial savings of the private sector have gone up tremendously. And it's of course not the savings of the poorer people, it's the savings of companies, it's the savings of rich people. And these financial savings have a depressing effect on the global economy. They create a demand gap, and the demand gap in some countries it could be compensated by increasing fiscal deficits of the government. That's what you can see in the United States, in Japan, the UK, countries which had huge fiscal deficits. In Japan still have huge fiscal deficits. And in Europe, where the ability of governments to compensate this demand gap that was created by growing inequality, the ability of the governments to fill this gap was much more restricted. That's why, in my view, we have this very dismal economic performance of the euro area in total.
Professor Bofinger, our last question is related to the flourishing public debate about the need to change the way economics are taught. What do you recall on this, please? What's your opinion?
Well, I think there's a problem with the teaching of economics, especially if you look at the major textbooks, and especially on the textbooks on macroeconomics. A economy is presented which is more or less self-stabilizing. So if you look in the textbook by Mankiw, which is probably the most popular textbook, this textbook shows the first semester student that deflation is a good way to stabilize an economy by itself. And this really frightening thing that the worst economic disease, deflation, is presented as a kind of self-stabilizing element of a market economy. And it goes on, if you look at these textbooks, for an explanation of involuntary unemployment, how it comes that suddenly, like in the US or in the euro area, suddenly unemployment goes up very strongly in 1 or 2 years. You do not find any economic analytical explanation of involuntary unemployment. That's what you find in all these textbooks. And it goes on and on. So if they present monetary policy, the impact of monetary policy, they normally start with a full equilibrium situation, and then monetary policy becomes expansionary, and of course it destabilizes the whole thing. And that's the way how, and then in the end, of course, after some time, the destabilizing effects vanish. But they do not present monetary policy as a reaction to a shock. They then would see it's the ideal solution. Now they have this full equilibrium situation, then monetary policy becomes active. So I think the main problem is that these textbooks present the macroeconomic system as a self-stabilizing system where government interference is only destabilizing, while in reality, and I think that's the experience that we've made in the last few years, that even a market economy tends to instability. There's some kind of near instability, and the governments are needed to stabilize the system. And of course, this wrong teaching of macroeconomics has an effect, because then the first semester students, then after some years, they become IMF advisors, and then they go to countries telling them it's no problem if you cut your public expenditures, and the impact on GDP will be very limited. That's exactly what you could see in Greece. The forecasts of the IMF for GDP were overly optimistic for many years. They did not really get the danger in this consolidation program. So I think that's direct implication of a completely flawed standard teaching of macroeconomics in most textbooks.
Professor Bofinger, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with ELIAMEP and the Greek audience.
Thank you.